Cassandra Lu, and I'm a member of the CHA's task force on the future of the PhD. Nous parlons de notre travail à Congrès, mais en parlant avec le comité des étudiants diplômés de la SHC. Et nous avons décidé d'héberger cette série de webinaires sur les carrières en histoire. John Walsh est un membre du comité et il est mon co-animateur aujourd'hui. And before turning it over to him, I would like to give a brief land acknowledgement, as will all our presenters. So I'm coming to you today from Canmore, Alberta, which is located in Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. It includes the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. And it's also the homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We'd love it if everyone wanted to say hi in the chat, and you could give us a sense of which Indigenous territories and universities or institutions you're all coming from and associated with. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Merci Tina et bienvenue à tous. Comme Tina vous avez signalé, je m'appelle John Walsh et je suis parmi les 7 membres du groupe de travail sur l'avenir du doctorate en histoire. I'm also an associate professor of history and public history at Carleton University, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe along the Kitchissippi River. So in today's webinar, we're grateful to have 5 PhD graduates who have, since completing their dissertations, moved on to careers in museums, public history, and universities. In 2 earlier webinars on the 19th and 27th of April, we heard from others who've transitioned from their doctoral studies into a wide range of careers in the private and public sector. And those webinars can be found at the CHA YouTube channel, and I'm going to post that link down in the chat. So just a quick word on structure. Tina and I will do introductions of each speaker in turn. Chacun disposerait de 10 minutes pour parler de son travail, de son cheminement dans sa carrière actuelle, and what tips they have for those looking to take a similar career direction with their historical training. You, the audience, will then have a half hour or more to pose questions. Nous vous invitons de participer en français ou bien anglais, comme vous voulez. So English or French is fine, and please just post your questions in the chat. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tina, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Cassandra Lucia is an assistant professor at Dalhousie University, and her research, as some of you may know, focuses on migration, ethnicity, and political culture in 20th century Canada. She earned her BA and MA from Queen's University and her PhD from the University of Toronto. And so, Kass, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So thanks everyone for having me. I live and work in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So in thinking about what to say today, I've admittedly struggled. It's very difficult to offer advice about how to approach the academic job market, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone here. Of course, at the most basic level, there's no one right way to do it. I also find that there's a lot of formulaic advice floating around out there, which doesn't acknowledge that ultimately academic work is finite. And there are a lot of systemic barriers that can void a lot of the advice that you get when you're working your way through grad school. So this has all been on my mind as I jotted down some notes for today. I'll try my best not to perpetuate some of these dynamics and to say something useful in the process. The reality of the job market didn't faze me much at the MA level. I saw it as a stepping stone either way to either academic work or something else. But it became a lot more serious of a concern as I debated the PhD, so much so that I actually took a year off to think about it. At least then, in the circles that I was in, there was a lot of prognosticating about how people who had gaps between degrees weren't serious. And I hope that this has since changed, but in case it hasn't, and you're at this phase, time off is a very responsible and healthy thing to do if you're not absolutely sure that you want to carry on and do the PhD. It's also a great way to save some money, which is very important. And I think like other folks in this series have already pointed out, an MA is often enough to actually get you in the door of some really interesting places where you can have an extremely fulfilling career. Time off also gets you out of this bubble of academia, which is a really intoxicating place in the early years. And this isn't super conducive to making big decisions, but it's critical at this stage to have a hard conversation with yourself. In the previous session, one of the speakers talked about how you need to ask yourself what it is that you actually like about being an academic. And getting out of that bubble gives you the chance to really define this and determine if continuing on to the PhD is necessary for what you want. When I finally decided that the PhD was for me, the first thing I did was set my terms. And this is probably one of the most crucial things that I did. So first of all, I didn't treat the application process like a numbers game, despite it still being pretty common then to hear that the PhD was some sort of golden ticket. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with folks who wish that they hadn't been made to believe that getting in was more important than the actual experience they'd have at a less than ideal fit. Because if you're at a school that can't support you in the specific ways you need supporting, that's all eventually going to have an impact on your performance on the market. In the broader sense, I just kind of, frankly, I refuse to see grad school as a one-way street. I think grad students are very conditioned to believing this, right? That they don't have any agency and should just be grateful for getting in somewhere and for tolerating all these things. I mean, everyone sort of has their own kind of horror stories. But the PhD is a huge, huge risk. We have to sort of be clear about that. So you need to do it in a dynamic that works for you. And you need to be deliberate in choosing a program that you think is going to give you the best shot. Now, everyone's checklist is going to look different. This is very subjective, but you're going to want to think about things like supervisor, funding packages, school prestige, school location, cohort size, collective faculty expertise, placement rates. You should also try to research what's happening in your field and how you might fit into it, right? And this is good advice for those of you already in a PhD program too. So check out where your favorite historians went to school and where they're now teaching. Look at recent hires and see where their degrees are from. Go to conferences and see who's winning awards, whose panels are making a buzz. Who did those folks work with? Are any of these people taking students? What jobs are coming up, right? Pay attention to not only what they call for, but also the pace at which they're appearing. You know, the institutions that they're appearing at and who ultimately gets hired. For me personally, the number one thing was supervision. And so I decided after doing all this research that I was going to go to U of T and I was going to work with my supervisor, or I wasn't going to do a PhD. And, you know, I wasn't trying to be dramatic. It's just that I knew that I was about to spend tens of thousands of dollars on pursuing a career that I loved, but that I couldn't guarantee would love me back. And so again, I sort of said to myself, if I'm going to do this, it's going to be under the conditions I want and under conditions that I think, based on my researched and educated guess, is going to give me the best chance of success. My next piece of advice is to try to treat grad school like it's the only time you'll ever be a historian, whether that ends up being true or not. So I really immersed myself in the experience to see if I even liked being a historian and to prepare myself for the pace of tenure track work. So while I was in grad school, I published 3 articles, a graphic novel. I started 2 co-edited volumes, all on non-dissertation topics, and I'll explain why that's relevant in a second. I organized multiple conferences. I sat on committees within my department and in the broader historical community. I taught 4 courses. I did some consulting in public history, and I involved myself in some historical activism. And all of this admittedly slowed down my dissertation. And in the end, I took about 7 years to do my PhD. So I'm not a model grad student in any sense. But overall, frankly, I don't regret resisting the idea of getting in and out in 4 years. And based on previous speakers in this series, I think that seems to be a common sentiment. I also had kind of set a timeline for myself of how long I was willing to look for academic work once I graduated. So I decided to kind of front end building my CV so that once I was on the market, I could feel confident in it. And if the time came to walk away, I could do so without the what if. I didn't want to fall into this trap of, you know, if I just had one more article or one more conference presentation, I'll get work in the next cycle. I really wanted to avoid that. And I never had to start that clock because I was hired ABD, but in and of itself, I think that this is evidence of this approach working, because I don't think I would have interviewed if the search committee felt I was a big risk. And there's certainly, by the way, a broader conversation to be had here about why as a profession we allow what I call CV inflation to become acceptable when it very much so used to be the case that grad school was for the dissertation and the dissertation alone, but that's for another day. The other added benefit of taking a bit longer was that it really diversified my expertise. My job call was for a 19th or 20th century historian of Canada who focused on law, justice, and society. The committee was also interested in someone whose work addressed transnational issues and or the carceral state. So my dissertation covered all of this except for the carceral state. But to return back to my non-dissertation publishing, this was all coincidentally almost all on carceral themes. And so I didn't just have a theoretical interest or, you know, a line in the cover letter about how I'm going to pivot to carceral studies down the line. I had a proven track record because I had spent the time exploring other non-dissertation interests. My next piece of advice is not to unnaturally tailor yourself to trends. It's one thing to make sure your work aligns with where we are as a profession and what ideas we want to collectively advance. It's a whole other thing to try to check off every single buzzword. You really have no idea what the job calls are going to be when you hit the market. And so when I was starting out, for example, like I was warned a lot that I would probably never be competitive in an open call for Canadianists, because as somebody who primarily wrote about Ukrainians in Canada, people would see me as doing community studies. And this warning was fair, but at the same time, I wasn't just going to give up on my project. And this isn't revisionist history because I got work. I just felt that there was either going to be, you know, space for me or not, and it was going to be a solid contribution or not. And a lot of this was up to me to ensure. But what I wasn't going to do was to disingenuously latch on to things that I had no business studying or that I couldn't effectively write about. Another important thing to do, in my opinion, is to get involved in your grad society if you have one, or another body that can engage in collective action when it comes to hiring practices. For example, if you're at an institution that requires a cover letter, a teaching dossier, a writing sample, 3 reference letters up front, et cetera, for a 12-month contract, say something, right? Or if the tenure track job requires these things of everyone and not just their shortlist, say something. Of course, some of these things are dictated by HR or a union and you can't change them. And of course, you should expect to do more work for tenure track applications. That's completely normal, but there are places to make some noise. And this will have reverberations on your eventual job search, because once you're on the market, it's almost too late. There's very little you can do, right? Complaining is a sure way to guarantee you will not get the job. But if you can sort of advocate on this front in advance, right, as grad students, if you start, you know, drawing your department's attention rather to the fact that, you know, asking someone who is applying for contract after contract to constantly produce letters up front is probably one of the cruelest things you can ask of someone, then maybe we can start chipping away at and shifting the culture of hiring. And this, again, might pay off because it might mean that you enter into a market that's a bit less you know, soul sucking and degrading and a bit more benevolent. So yeah, once you're ready to start applying, whether, you know, you're still in grad school or not, I would recommend applying when you're in grad school. The application and the interview process is a whole other can of worms. Obviously, I can't get into them today, but I will quickly say that you should check to see if your department has a committee that helps prep you for jobs. Mine did, and they were beyond helpful. You can also usually turn to your sort of networks that you're going to develop while you're in grad school, find people who are willing to talk to you who also got work. These are, again, connections you'll sort of organically make, you know, through going to Congress and things like that. And I'll just end by saying, for those of you who are worried about maybe not having those networks, I'm always happy to chat with anyone at any stage about strategy. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like to chat. I'll end there.
Thanks, Cassandra. Our next speaker, Karen Rutledge, est historienne pour Parcs Canada. Elle vit à Whitehorse et travaille avec les parcs nationaux et le site historique du nord du Canada sur une grande variété de projets d'histoire. She's also involved with the local historical community in Whitehorse, especially as a board member and volunteer for Hidden History Society Yukon. Karen, thanks so much for being here. Take it away.
Thanks. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm just going to introduce myself in Dunklunjay or Southern Shoshone, which is one of the Indigenous languages here in Whitehorse. Zenyu Shuklathan, Aiji Karen Routledge, Uye, Kwanlin Union J, Vancouver Union J Kuchena, Scottish Ye English Iche, and Parks Canada Ajasila U. So I'm Karen, I live in Whitehorse. I'm originally from Vancouver. I have English and Scottish ancestors, so I'm a settler. I'm a historian for Parks Canada, and I'm grateful to live on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'anquichin Council. Je vais faire la présentation uniquement en anglais, mais si vous voulez me poser des questions en français, je peux tenter de vous répondre en français après. So, yeah, in case some of you don't know exactly what Parks Canada does, it's the Canadian government agency that's responsible for national parks, national historic sites, and national marine conservation areas in Canada, and also the Pingo Canadian Landmark, which I mentioned, because it's a great site and it always gets left off these lists. Today, there are about 25 historians working full-time for Parks Canada. About half of them work for national programs based in Ottawa, and the rest of us mainly work with individual parks and sites. I came to this job partly by chance. I had met my predecessor, the parks historian in Whitehorse, David Neufeld, who's pictured here, way back when I was an undergrad, and I thought his job sounded amazing, but during grad school, I became very focused on becoming a professor. By the time I was finishing my PhD, though, I was really starting to question if I would get an academic job, and if I even wanted one, given that I wouldn't be able to choose where I lived, and my partner and I probably wouldn't get jobs together, at least not right away. So when I heard that Parks Canada had posted this historian job, I applied, and I was really lucky to get it because I had not spent my grad school career preparing for a job in public history. So in a few minutes, I'll give you some tips on things I did and other things that I should have done. Honestly, for a while after grad school, I felt like a bit of a failure for not having tried harder to get an academic job, but I really don't feel that way at all anymore. I appreciate being able to work on projects that reach a wide audience. And I also really like that I get to work on teams on all my projects with people who have all different backgrounds and types of expertise. For most of my projects, that includes a lot of different Parks Canada staff and also staff from First Nations governments and/or Métis and Inuit organizations. I've worked on everything from exhibits to policy documents to one memorable project that involved sorting through a collection of objects left behind by scientists in the high Arctic that was at this park shown here. So I really have no regrets, and I don't look at academic jobs anymore or think about them at all. And yeah, I was going to talk more about my work, but I realized Tina's going to cut me off. So I'll just briefly mention, I'll just briefly mention two projects. This was one of them. It was an Inuktitut place names map for Ayuitlip National Park on Baffin Island. This is most of our working group. We had a series of workshops that brought together experts from two communities, and we worked together to create a new map of the park with Inuktitut names on it. And here in Whitehorse, I've also recently finished a project to redo the exhibits at the SS Klondike, which, as you can see, is a dry docked paddle wheel riverboat here in downtown Whitehorse. And for this project, our core team included Parks Canada staff and staff from the two local First Nations governments. And we also met with staff from 7 other First Nations governments whose territories the riverboats used to travel in. Now I'll move on to tips for anyone who might be interested in a government job. Sorry, I realize this is the museum panel, but I can't really offer museum advice. First of all, I would try to consider all your career options seriously. When I accepted this job in 2010, several of my professors, not Tina, were a bit disappointed, and they suggested that I could maybe just use this job as a stopgap until the academic job market improved. And I know that their concern came from a place of care and really wanting the best for me, but I also think it was because they just didn't know this job and they didn't know how fulfilling it could be for me. And I also recommend seeking out people both inside and outside academia who'd have jobs that interest you. And I know it's intimidating, but I would just ask them if they'd be willing to have a phone call or video chat with you. And I really think a lot of them will be happy to do this, especially if it's not urgent. I mean, there's some times of the year when I'm just too busy, but most of the time I'm really happy to talk to people about my job and how I came to it. For federal government jobs, they're all posted on jobs.gc.ca and often nowhere else. So I would start looking now to get a sense of what kind of jobs are being posted and what they're asking for in terms of qualifications. A lot of other governments, like territorial, provincial, First Nations governments, city governments, they also use their own websites to post jobs and they don't post on other portals. So I would start checking those out as well. And a lot of them allow you to set email alerts so you don't have to keep checking back. For the federal public service, there's also a program called Recruitment of Policy Leaders that's designed to create a pool of candidates who can be hired directly into federal jobs. If you Google it, you'll find their website. They don't have any applications open right now, but a lot of departments do recruit here every year. I didn't go through this program, so I can't really speak to it, but I have a colleague who did, who recommends it. And I know that grad students are really busy, but I think one reason I got my job was that I had done one public history contract as a grad student that I could talk about when I was asked interview questions. So you never know when something that seems small might come in handy. I'd also worked in Nunavut during my PhD, and I'd done both oral history and archival research, and that really helped for this particular job. So if you can, I would try to diversify your work experience and skills. Having like one different thing on your resume will almost certainly mean more than having taught one more course or whatever most of your experience is. Yeah, applying for government jobs, I could say a lot about this, but I'll keep it short. I'm sure you all can handle it. It's really time consuming. Basically, you have to apply through the government's online portal and upload all your information there. If you've applied for SSHRC and put your CV into their system, you get the idea. If they ask you to explain how you meet the qualifications, like often they have a section where you have to give paragraph answers for each qualification, make sure you do that even if it's on your resume, or you probably will not screen in for an interview. If you do get an interview, do some reading about the department, just like you would for a university interview. I think academics often don't think about reading policy documents, but look for those online and read them. Also look at any Indigenous final agreements or impact and benefit agreements that would apply to where you'll be working. Yeah, government hiring timelines, they can be slower than you would believe. I actually got hired fairly quickly, but my husband's applied on a lot of government jobs, and in the worst cases, it's taken over a year for him to hear back. So this slow timeline can be a reason to start applying sooner than you would for academic jobs. And also, if you get an interview and don't get a job, you can ask for a debrief on why, and almost always someone will call you and go through the interview and explain why you didn't get the job. And this can be really useful for next time. Yeah, I would also keep in mind that now more than ever, a lot of managers really aren't fussy on where their staff are located. So even if a job is, for example, posted in Ottawa, it's worth asking if you can potentially do it from elsewhere. And just finally, some general advice, I would say, think about what you love and maybe what you hate about your work as a grad student. What brought you to this field? What do you really like about grad school? Is it research, teaching, writing, analysis, managing projects? and what kind of careers would allow you to keep doing that? Also, are you willing to move, or do you need to stay in your current city? Do you have other obligations or hobbies or volunteer work that require a certain work schedule? I don't think any of these things are incompatible with having a great career, but they are probably incompatible with seizing every career opportunity or demand that comes along. So you will have to make choices, and I would just think about what you want to be holding on to at the end of it. Yeah, Shoni Sana, Janasa, Yudat-san, Kushike, Tlaho Kweche. Thanks so much, I'm done, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thanks so much, Karen. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharanjit Sandhra. She is coordinator of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, also co-curator of exhibits at the Sikh Heritage Museum located in the National Historic Site Gurd Sikh Temple in Abbotsford, British Columbia. And she's also a sessional faculty member in the history department at the University of the Fraser Valley. Dans le cadre de son doctorat, Sharon étudie les expériences affectives des visiteurs de musées racialisés sous l'angle de la théorie critique des races. C'est une militante passionnée qui jette des ponts entre communauté et le monde universitaire par le biais de son travail dans les musées. Elle a été membre de la BC Museums Association et est actuellement directrice du Pacific Canada Heritage Center, the Museum of Migration. Thanks so much, Sharon, for being here and talking about this subject from your perspective.
Thank you, Tina. I'm going to begin by acknowledging the lands that I'm speaking from. Perfect. So this is a sign that we currently have on site at the Sikh Heritage Museum, and it just is standing in solidarity with the Saltamuk, the Stalo peoples of the Halkomelem language, whose lands that I live and work from and engage in a lot of the activist work that I do. So my story today is exactly that. It's a story. I'm here to share how academia crafts us to be something in a box, and what my experience has been very much outside the box of the academy. And what I hope to do is foster and motivate this idea of being unorthodox in the academy, and how we are now open and shifting our understanding, for example, by working in the museum sector and working in the cultural sector. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. I think I'll go well below 10 minutes because I do like the Q&A part. So I'm really hoping we can have some good conversations then. So my journey in the PhD program at UBC involved being the very first Sikh graduate to graduate from the Department of History at UBC. I was full-time working. I was a mother. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of when I started my PhD looking much, much younger with my boys, Galvin and Joven. And the picture on the right-hand side are my boys today, basically. And Galvin will be turning 13 and Joven will be 11. So I had a 6-year gap between my master's and my PhD. And I also took 8 years to complete my PhD because of a lot of the factors that I'm sharing with you. And what I want to highlight is that that is okay. I think as graduate students, there is an expectation to rush, but also an expectation based on assumptions of, not having all these external intersectional experiences to our lives. And I must say, when I did begin the program at UBC, I was the only person of color. There was one other woman of color who was in the cohort with me. I was surrounded by a lot of cis-het white men, and that is not right. Like in a PhD program, we need to diversify. We need to be in a place where we are fostering that sort of space of belonging at the graduate levels in all PhD programs across Canada. That was 8 years ago. And I know for a fact that a lot of exciting change has happened and there's a lot of hope. But I do need to emphasize the fact that those barriers and gatekeeping and access points cause a lot of trauma when you are, harboring so many other layers to your life as a PhD student. Now, when it comes to my work in museums, This has been the site of belonging for me. And it is through the experience of being a co-curator at the Sikh Heritage Museum that despite not feeling a sense of belonging in the beginning in my PhD program at UBC, I was able to find belonging through my community work. And the one piece of advice that I would give to graduate students is when you are engaging with the work of community, don't engage as though it is an extractive. I think historically, anthropologically, any sort of humanities, social science field, especially through the lens of colonialism, it is very extractive, right? You're engaging in these projects with communities for your own tenure, for your own dissertation, for your own research, in good faith often, right? Like there is often a lot of good faith that you want to be able to provide a light and a lens on these histories. But the problem is it's extractive because you forget about it or you move on into other forms of, your career and your pathways and your life. My greatest strength and the reason why I've been able to do the work that I'm doing and build so many relationships is because relationships are at the core of everything that I do. Tina mentioned that I'm a current director of the Pacific Canada Heritage Centre Museum of Migration. This is one community organization that I am so honored to be a part of, and community members who aren't South Asian. They come from a broad perspective of Asian Canadian communities, and I've never felt such a feeling of family, of belonging, of relationship building. In fact, they ended up being one of my interviewees for my PhD. The relationships that we build throughout our careers should always be a constant. And I think that will help you foster, I hate the word social capital, but it will foster that kind of cyclical way of finding those future career paths. I think as graduate students, the more we imagine the possibilities outside of academia as being this very specific way of completing a process, the more we move outside of that box, the more we open up the possibilities of engagement and jobs in the cultural sector. And for me, it's been the museum sector as well. So the images that you see are of me speaking at one of our exhibit launches called We Are Hockey. So we did an exhibit looking at racialized histories of ice hockey in Canada, and it's been one of the most successful exhibits that we've ever done. And because of that, we've had partnerships with like Canucks and Rogers Canada and Hockey Night in Canada Punjabi. That's an example of the cyclicality of these relationship buildings. And this exhibit was in 2019, and I still have relationships with all these people. And I don't just drop the ball, right? This motivation behind this dissertation was actually from a colleague, Dr. Courtney Zito, who did her PhD on South Asians and ice hockey, and she brought the exhibit idea to us. Once again, the power of community and relationships. So the concept that I use, and I probably will end here just to give space for Q&A, but the driving force of the work that I do is around Bell Hook's concept of the power in the margins. And we just lost Bell Hooks very prematurely, a very young age in December. And she's actually the person that I end my PhD dissertation with. And I think it's very apropos that I do end with her. She talks about this idea of the power in the margins. And I think for PhD students who are especially racialized PhD students or who are mothers or who have these multiplicities of identities and lives, I think we can find strength in those margins and we can find solidarity and camaraderie in those margins rather than trying to conform to a center in the way that it's always been. And so I use bell hooks as the driving force of the motivation work that I do, including the museum exhibits that I curate. So since this theme today is talking about museums, my dissertation looks at museums as spaces of belonging. And what I did was compare and contrast 3 Asian Canadian museums and how people who visited those sites fostered their own sense of belonging. So it was the Nikkei National Museum, a Japanese Canadian museum, the Sikh Heritage Museum, and the Burnaby Village Museum did a very first exhibit on its Chinese Canadian communities called Across the Pacific. What I found was the language of belonging that all the racialized visitors felt in these spaces, to me, is the model that other museums need to foster. Now, the image that you see is a part of the erasure in the archive as well. It's a very common image that we have seen when we Google search 1907 anti-Asian riots. but many people don't know the full humanity and history of this story. And I found that out because of my relationships and friendships at the Nikkei National Museum. So when I was giving them a tour, they said, do you know the story of this picture? And I said, no. Often when I even Google search it, the Sikh man with the turban is cut off, right, in the archive. So it turns out that this picture is right after the Sikh man and a group of his friends had helped his best friend, who was the Japanese Canadian owner of this shop, clean up after the anti-Asian riots happened. So they just finished cleaning up and this snapshot was taken. Now, the little baby who's being held by her mom was interviewed by the Nikkei National Museum. And she told the story about how the Sikh man helped her family relocate and not be forced into the internment camps that took place during World War II and when Japanese Canadians were forced to be interned. This story is an example of the power of relationships and the power of museum work to create wholeness and humanity in these experiences and stories. Because if it was not for my relationship with them, I would never have learned this story. And in fact, nobody, as far as I knew this story. The tragedy is we don't know the Sikh man's name. And that's part of the namelessness in many ways of the White Archive, right? I'm sure we know the name of the cops. I'm sure we know the name of the photographer, but we don't know the name of the Sikh man. Now, the reason why I'm going to connect this and end this all is that relationships and kind of unsilencing those silences are at the core of the value systems that I think a lot of future PhD students need to bring with them in terms of ethics as well. And I hope and I'm excited that it is happening. And I think there's a huge accountability taking place within the academy. And so on that note, I will end and I look forward to a lot of Q&A afterwards where I can probably provide a bit more detailed advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. What a brilliant rereading of that image that so many of us have seen. Our next speaker, Sarah Glassford, est une archiviste et historien qui est bien ancrée dans les deux camps. Elle ouvre à la Lady Library de l'Université de Windsor en tant qu'archiviste depuis juillet 2019. She also holds the liaison librarian role for history and advises on university-wide records management. From 2007 to 2016, her first career as a history professor took her to the University of Ottawa, Carleton University, the University of Prince Edward Island, and the University of New Brunswick, where she taught a variety of Canadian social histories. She continues to research and publish in Canadian history and is an active member of professional associations in both history and archives. Thanks for being here, Sarah, and take it away.
Thank you. I was thinking as I've been listening to all of these other stories, personal stories and career paths, it's only 5 years now since I made the shift from full-time academic historian, pursuing that path wholeheartedly, to becoming an archivist. And I guess now I would identify as an archivist-historian. But my narrative around what that means, why I did it, and how it feels to have done that has changed a lot over time. And in other ways, it still is changing. So the exercise of deciding what am I going to say to graduate students who might be, pursuing some of these paths has been tricky and emotional, and I was feeling a little triggered listening to things about the academic job market from Cassandra and all sorts of things coming up. But I'm trying to focus on like the happy version of my narrative that has kind of a dark origin story. I really went for the academic career, and after 10 years, it didn't happen. And I decided that I needed to pursue something else. So I pursued something else, and I've thrown myself into being an archivist and an archivist historian. And that's what I want to focus on today. So the reason that I chose, when I was looking deliberately to kind of make a left turn and pursue a different career as a second career, I decided to become an archivist specifically because of something that I want to show you as part of my land acknowledgement, just the power of archives and the wonder of archives. So I am here in the University of Windsor. We're on the traditional lands of the Three Fires Confederacy that's composed of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people. And they shared their land with Huron-Wendat refugees after the destruction of Huronia. So on one edge of our university is Huron Church Road, and there are other sort of place names that certainly demarcate the Indigenous presence here. I'm also, as an archivist, custodian of a small number of documents that offer a glimpse into our local Indigenous history. So I brought some show and tell, and I have here this wonderful land sharing agreement signed with animal dudums, little animal drawings, and the names of local Detroit River region Potawatomi chiefs from 1780. It's written in French and is, you know, that wonderful thick kind of parchment paper and fading ink and all of these wonderful things. And for me, being an archivist, having access to these kinds of documents as part of my daily work brings to life the real people and communities and stories that we all write about as historians, and just connects me to the past, and specifically in this case to the Indigenous past, in a very powerful way. So always nice to have an excuse for show and tell as an archivist. So I decided to become an archivist because it's a history adjacent field that allows me to work with primary documents, both physical and of course now increasingly digital. And also, and this is specific to my job, I'm kind of a Jill of all trades archivist. I'm the only archivist in my workplace. So I decide whose stories and voices are preserved for posterity in my archives. And since my background is as a social historian and a historian of women and children, it will not surprise you that I'm very committed to bringing the records of ordinary people and of marginalized communities into my archives when it's possible to do that in a respectful and non-acquisitive way. Being an archivist also draws on a number of strengths, skills, and personality traits that I possess, and I thought I would take the time to list them and why they're valuable in case any of those sound like you. You know, archives might be a good option for you. So first is my historical research skills. Arranging and describing a new fond or collection involves the exact same kinds of detective work that are involved in dissertation research. You've got all these fragments, everything's all mixed up, and your brain is putting it together and trying to make sense and make a story out of it so that other researchers can then open a nice tidy box and find all these nicely arranged files and make their own sense of it as part of a bigger story. Attention to detail, I won't say much about that. It matters so much in this job. If you don't have that attention to detail, go elsewhere, you will hate this. Third is a natural inclination to organize things. If you have that personality trait, you will find bringing order out of chaos as an archivist to be deeply satisfying. That is a lot of what we do, is to bring order out of chaos. And then finally, three kind of interlinked traits: initiative, flexibility, and independence. And what I mean by that is there is so much to do in absolutely any archives at all times. The number of jobs currently existing across the hallway in our vault will outlast my lifetime and my entire career. Every box you open, there are 20 jobs that should or could be done to make them better discoverable and accessible, and to preserve them and all those sorts of things. So you have to have some initiative and patience to do that kind of a job that never ends. There's also not the rhythm of the academic year. We don't have high points and quiet points, and summer means nothing because it's just the same as every other, you know, day of lots of jobs to do. So you have to have that kind of drive and initiative. Flexibility is important because for every archival principle or guideline, there are dozens of exceptions. We deal with the weird stuff that doesn't fit a nice tidy pattern. And so we have to do everything from finding what box or folder or drawer will fit this weirdly shaped thing, to how do we conserve this item, to how do we make connections between all of these unconnected things and explain it to someone what they might find in this collection. So being flexible and making those subjective decisions is important. And finally, again, in my specific position as the only archivist here, independence. I have to be okay with being the only person with my particular expertise in this entire university. Nobody tells me what to do or how to do it, and that was a little bit intimidating in my first week of the job. I didn't have a clue where to start, but I figured it out, and now I've come to really like the autonomy that I have. So as I said, if any of those traits sound like you, this could be the perfect career for you. And really, no day is the same as the day before it. There are tedious aspects. Some days you're really dirty from handling old documents and you spend all day writing penciled labels on file folders. You know, that's not the greatest day that I have, but it's also satisfying. And other days, today we had a nationally famous dominatrix, who is also a donor to our archives, come and pay a visit because a local feminist theater has produced a play about her life, and she wanted to come and look at her stuff, and we had some media and, you know, all this sort of thing. So that's a very different day from the file labeling day, and those are both parts of my job. So it is a little bit of everything as an archivist, I think. I also would add back to the historical side of things that your historical knowledge and training will come in handy in this line of work in a whole lot of ways. I mean, anytime I have to try and describe a photograph, I'm so grateful that I have spent so much time reading history and looking in archives as a researcher that I can just look at a photograph and be like, oh, that's a cloche hat, that's 1920s. Whereas, you know, previously it may have been described as woman beside car, you know, a date unknown. So having that, just things that I don't even know that I know, make my job so much easier. And you know, bottom line, your history degrees will not get you a job as an archivist, but they sure are an asset once you have the job. And I think that's, you know, a great outcome for any line of work you might go into. As was mentioned in my introduction, I am an archivist in an academic library. So there are parts of my job that are librarianship. I could talk about that, but we don't really have time. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. That is one of the challenges of my job, is that I work with people who have slightly different training and focus. And so I have to be an advocate for the archives in that context that's really focused on very different sorts of things. We never have enough resources. We never have enough space. We certainly don't have enough staff. You know, I have to sort of explain why what we need is important or what we do is important, but I also take that very seriously. I'm passionate about the past. And so that's, you know, a meaningful part of my job as well as kind of an annoying one, which is a funny kind of context for that. In terms of job market, there are jobs in the archives field. It's not the greatest time, but it's also a heck of a lot better job market than the academic job market. So that should be encouraging. And if you happen to be under 30 years of age, you would qualify for the Young Canada Works program, which funds a ton of heritage jobs, including so many entry-level archives jobs. I wish I had been under 30 when I started. It was a real disadvantage that I wasn't, because a whole slew of really great jobs just went out the window for me. So definitely look into that if you're interested. And they don't require you to have a degree. That's, you know, literally entry-level, gets you good job experience, and then you can think about the training that you need. The University of Toronto iSchool, their School of Information Studies, they have an amazing job site that will similarly give you a glimpse of like what kinds of jobs are out there, entry-level, more advanced. And that's all kinds of information professions, librarianship, knowledge management, research, records management, but also archives. I will just mention that this is a career path for which you need additional training. You will have to go back to school if you want to become a librarian or an archivist. It is technically possible to become an archivist with just any degree at like one institution, but really that's kind of a dying avenue. So you need to find either a Master of Archival Studies program, UBC and University of Manitoba are the two that I know of, or you can also do Master of Library and Information Studies or Master of Information Studies, and that's Western, U of T, Dalhousie, University of Alberta, McGill. I think those are the big ones. It's normally a 2-year commitment. I did the accelerated program at Western, which was 3 semesters with an optional co-op. I did the co-op because I was a mature student and I sure wanted that job experience on my resume. It was great. My co-op ended up phoning me. Imagine someone phoning you to offer you a job you hadn't applied for. That was a very happy ending to my story after leaving the academic job market. So that was my starter job. I did some other short-term contracts, and just almost exactly a year after I finished my MLIS degree, I got my job here at Windsor. And I am now, ironically, working at a university in a tenure track job, about to apply for tenure in about a year's time. So not in my first choice field, but fairly darn close. So that's why I say I'm both a cautionary tale and also a happy ending. So I hope that, you know, archives should be on every history student's radar, at least to consider, because as historians, we all benefit when people with historical expertise are working in those behind the scenes roles and, you know, doing the reference work, doing the organization and that sort of thing. So happy to take any questions about that or about libraries as well.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Our final speaker is Olivier Côté. Olivier est le conservateur responsable des médias et des communications au Musée canadien de l'histoire. In 2014, he published a book called Construire la Nation au petit écran, a monograph on that TV documentary series, Canada, A People's History, which I had occasion to work with. So now I'm feeling definitely that I'm history. It was produced by the CBC. It's still floating around today. And he's a founding member of the website Histoire Engagée. Olivier, and I will keep time for you as well. Thank you for joining us.
Parfait. Ben, merci de m'avoir aujourd'hui. Je vais faire ma présentation en français, but feel free to ask me any question in English if you're more at ease. Donc, avant de commencer ma présentation, j'aimerais vraiment reconnaître que le Musée canadien d'histoire à Gatineau est situé sur le territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine-Anishinaabe. Comme Tina le mentionnait, je suis conservateur des médias de communication au Musée d'histoire. Je suis un historien des médias. Concrètement, ce que je fais là, dans la vie, là, au quotidien, dans mon travail, c'est que je suis chargé du contenu des expositions. Donc, c'est moi qui dois choisir les objets, les images, les extraits audiovisuels, qui fait l'écriture des textes. Je suis chargé également des nouvelles acquisitions d'artefacts, d'objets. Je mène différents projets de recherche. Et donc, le musée pour lequel je travaille est une sorte d'interface idéale entre la recherche universitaire et, j'oserais dire, la vulgarisation scientifique. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous présenter certaines facettes de mon parcours universitaire professionnel. Et donc, d'abord, je vais vous parler de ma formation, comment elle m'a aidé à travailler comme conservateur. Ensuite, comment ai-je été amené à travailler dans le monde muséal. Et finalement, je vais m'intéresser à qu'est-ce qui a favorisé mon embauche. Puis finalement, je vais conclure avec des conseils généraux. Évidemment, ici, je parle de mon profil, de mon expérience à moi. Et donc, évidemment, ça ne peut pas être, ça n'a pas de valeur universelle, mais peut-être que ça va vous inspirer certaines réflexions. Sur ma formation, à la base, moi, je me suis toujours intéressé à la représentation du passé à la télévision, au monde de l'histoire appliquée, des cultural studies, des études en communication. Donc, j'ai un côté, j'oserais dire, très hybride, très interdisciplinaire, qui m'a permis de toucher à une variété de sujets. Et donc, la question qu'on peut se poser, ben, comment mon doctorat m'a-t-il préparé à travailler dans le monde des musées? Je dirais d'abord que le fait d'être un canadianiste a constitué un avantage parce que pour avoir travaillé en histoire canadienne, en histoire québécoise, ça m'a aidé grandement pour le simple fait que, ben, d'abord, les expositions sont souvent sur des sujets canadiens. Ensuite, les collections sont souvent canadiennes. Donc, j'ose croire que ça m'a aidé. Je dirais aussi que ma capacité de recherche, la polyvalence dans la recherche d'informations, le fait d'avoir travaillé avec une variété de fonds d'archives, ça a été certainement un atout. Évidemment, la rigueur qu'on acquiert dans notre formation, l'importance qu'on peut accorder à la véracité des faits, ça a été vraiment essentiel, notamment dans la production de textes d'exposition. Et aussi ma capacité de synthèse, évidemment, la capacité de structurer ma pensée. Ça peut paraître banal, mais quand vous avez à résumer la guerre de Corée en 75 mots, ben, je dois dire que d'avoir une capacité de synthèse, ça devient fort utile. Évidemment, aussi le côté discipline, persévérance, assiduité, constance, ça a été essentiel parce que présentement, je suis sur un gros projet d'exposition, puis c'est un projet qui s'est étalé sur 3 ans. Et donc, le fait d'avoir entrepris des études de doctorat a fait en sorte que ça m'a habilité à ce type de travail de longue haleine. Donc, c'est un travail de marathonien intellectuel, j'oserais dire. Le seul point faible que je pourrais dire sur la formation en histoire, c'est vraiment le côté culture matérielle des objets. C'est quelque chose que je n'ai pas beaucoup abordé dans le cadre de ma formation, puis que j'ai eu à compléter à l'extérieur de ma formation d'historien. Donc là, par rapport à mon parcours professionnel, on pourrait se demander qu'est-ce qui m'a amené à travailler dans le monde muséal. Contrairement à certains collègues que j'ai entendus, ben moi, j'ai toujours eu ce souhait de travailler à l'extérieur de l'université. J'ai toujours choisi cette idée d'y aller l'angle de la vulgarisation scientifique des musées. Ça m'a toujours intéressé, fasciné. Notamment, j'avais travaillé en 2008 pour le Musée canadien des civilisations, anciennement nommé l'ancien nom de mon musée, avec l'historien John Willis. J'ai fondé la revue Histoire engagée, comme ça a été mentionné en introduction. Et donc, pour moi, l'idée de travailler en dehors de l'université, ça n'a jamais été considéré comme un plan B. Mais moi, c'était mon premier plan, c'était vraiment cette idée de sortir de ce monde universitaire. Et je dirais que ce qui m'a vraiment distingué, c'est que j'ai pu, oui, travailler dans le monde de la recherche, mais j'ai travaillé dans le milieu associatif, notamment dans l'association étudiante à l'Université Laval, à la Société historique du Canada dans différentes fonctions. Donc, ça m'a permis de bâtir un réseau intéressant, puis aussi d'avoir des antennes sur les possibilités d'emploi qui s'offraient à moi. Et en 2012, j'ai travaillé au ministère de la Culture et des Communications du Québec. Donc, ça a facilité mon passage du monde universitaire au monde de la culture, du patrimoine. Et je dirais que toutes ces expériences-là ont fait en sorte que quand j'ai venu le temps de postuler au poste du Musée canadien de l'histoire, j'avais un profil, je dirais, à certains égards intéressant. Et donc, d'abord, quand il y a eu le poste de conservateur, il y a des gens de mon réseau qui m'ont tout de suite dit hey, « Pourquoi tu ne postulerais pas sur ce poste-là? Et tu me sembles avoir le profil. » Puis je dois dire que, évidemment, le fait d'être un historien des médias, ça faisait en sorte que mon profil pouvait être potentiellement intéressant pour le musée. Il n'y en a pas des tonnes. Je dois dire aussi que mon double profil de vulgarisateur, de chercheur aguerri a sans doute été un atout. Et donc, j'ai cette facilité de faire des recherches universitaires, mais aussi d'avoir cette capacité de parler au grand public, de faire des expositions, de faire des publications plus accessibles. Et donc, je veux insister ici sur l'importance d'avoir des expériences à l'extérieur du monde de l'université également, lorsque l'occasion se présente. Évidemment, si votre objectif, c'est de travailler dans des musées ou dans des centres d'archives ou dans le monde de l'édition, c'est extrêmement important d'avoir des expériences en dehors du monde de l'université. Et donc, avec beaucoup de chance, puis évidemment, parce que j'avais un certain profil qui était requis, là, on m'a engagé, puis j'étais extrêmement heureux de ça parce que, il s'est avéré avec le temps, ça fait quoi? Ça va faire 6 ans cette année que je travaille au musée. Puis ce que j'apprécie vraiment, c'est le fait qu'on est à horaire fixe, contrairement au monde universitaire où les horaires sont beaucoup plus atypiques. J'aime le fait que je travaille sur une variété de tâches, que ces tâches sont non répétitives. Pour moi, c'est une grande stimulation intellectuelle. Le désavantage, je dirais, si on parle, mettons, on compare avec le monde des universités ou si j'étais devenu professeur, je dirais que globalement, les salaires sont un peu moindres. On a peut-être aussi moins d'autonomie parce qu'on doit constamment nourrir, on a constamment des demandes du musée et tout. J'imagine qu'il y a quand même des similitudes, là. Et il y a toujours beaucoup de choses à livrer dans un court laps de temps. Donc, parfois, ça fait en sorte qu'on a peut-être moins le temps de peaufiner notre travail. Et donc, si j'avais à vous dire certains conseils pour travailler dans le monde des musées, je vous dirais d'abord, c'est certain que le fait d'être canadianiste, c'est un atout. Évidemment, si le poste affiché demande un champ de spécialisation en histoire canadienne, je pense à Parc Canada, au Musée canadien ou à d'autres institutions. Par contre, la formation universitaire en histoire, que ce soit maîtrise, doctorat, ça peut ouvrir des portes en dehors de votre champ de spécialisation. Je dirais notamment auprès de la fonction publique parce que la formation d'historien est reconnue pour sa rigueur et le fait que, justement, ça forme des gens qui sont capables de penser, capables de réfléchir, capables d'analyser tout ça. L'autre élément que j'aimerais évoquer, puis je l'ai évoqué déjà, c'est l'idée de valoriser les expériences aussi en dehors du parcours traditionnel. Quand je dis parcours traditionnel, je parle de publications, colloques, séances, numéros thématiques. Si vous avez, je dois vous dire ça, c'est très important ce que j'ai à vous dire là-dessus, si quelqu'un vous offre vous demande de vous faire parvenir votre CV pour un contrat qui peut sembler complètement banal, vraiment petit, tout ça, mon conseil, j'oserais vous prodiguer un conseil, c'est de ne jamais refuser les offres de contrat qui permettent de sortir du milieu universitaire. Moi, j'ai eu à parler à certains étudiants qui me disaient « Ah, je fais mes études au doctorat, je n'ai pas le temps de faire le contrat, tout ça. » Je dirais que souvent, le petit contrat de rien du tout peut devenir une porte d'entrée vraiment importante. Je dirais aussi que ça vous prendra pour vous une certaine flexibilité pour aller vers là où les emplois se trouvent, l'importance des milieux associatifs et finalement, je vous dirais d'adapter votre CV à l'employeur, à l'emploi pour lequel vous voulez postuler.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
John, I'll let you take it from here and just to remind people about the Q&A.
Sure, thank you, Tina. So I was wondering whether the panel as a whole, if you could talk about what, if any, elements within your PhD experience, whether it was through formal training or through experiences, that in hindsight sort of have sort of helped you negotiate the choices you've made in terms of career. So, Sharon, I feel like it is pretty repetitive for you, but I'm just wondering if the others, if you had those moments or those experiences. And Olivia, you did speak to some of this as well, but it just struck me as something really powerful how each of you shared your journeys. If you could maybe tie it a little back to your PhD training.
The thing for me, it was not PhD training, really, surprisingly, because I took an introductory course in museology at the BA level. So I think it was like a first step for me, thinking that it could be interesting to work in a museum setting. And then I pursued my my research and everything. But really, at the PhD level, I would say most of the courses I had, or even the advice I had, were made. Okay, you have to pursue a university career or something. Really, so that's why I said in my presentation, okay, for me, working outside of the university setting was a choice, really. But in some cases, I would say it's better to at least have a plan A or a plan B, thinking, okay, if I'm not a professor, who would I like to become? So I would say that. But again, it's all my own experience.
So my job doesn't require a PhD, it requires an MA. But that being said, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gotten it if I hadn't had the kinds of experiences that I had while doing my PhD, because Parks Canada was looking for someone who wanted to do work in the North, and I was almost like desperate to go back because I really had loved my time working in Nunavut and I didn't want to give up those relationships, but it's not the kind of place that's easy to go. And also, I guess, in terms of relationships, I mean, my job was actually posted in Calgary, and that's where I started. And a big reason why I moved here was because I felt that I couldn't develop the kind of relationships that I wanted to from when I was just flying in and flying out. So I wanted to live in a place where I could actually just go have lunch with people and see them socially, and not just see them at a work meeting and then fly home. So I think for probably all of our jobs, building relationships outside of our own offices are really important and a really rewarding part of what we do.
So I primarily study Ukrainian Canadian history, and there's kind of two sides to it. I always conceptualized it in this duality of there were these larger picture intellectual questions I was interested in answering in that I was focusing on in the thesis, but then there was also this aspect of the things I was interested in that were more rooted in commemoration, public history, redress over issues like internment. And so I was always kind of keeping an eye on both of these paths. I was trying to make the dissertation the best that it possibly could be, but then I also was trying to involve myself in these things that I was interested in academically that could be applied in careers that were more geared towards, museum work or public history or even activism. So I think if there's a way to sort of look at your topic in that way and see the different paths within it that you can take, that's a really useful thing to do.
Given that the CHA represents historians in Canada, not Canadianists, Marie-Pierre Bertholet asks basically, if you're not a Canadianist, if you don't study the history of Canada, but are trained as an historian, is she right to think that makes it a little more complex in terms of working in the various sectors that you're working in, museums, in libraries, archives, those sorts of things. What would you say to that?
I can start because I have a positive answer. Libraries and archives are wide open to you. I work with biologists, I work with philosophers, I work with computer scientists. I have colleagues in archives who spend their days organizing Canadian history stuff who don't even like history. So really it's about what you do with the stuff and your ability to analyze and synthesize and identify and organize. And if you happen to have an interest or you happen to have researched it, all the better, but really it's wide open. So that's two fields, I guess, that it's not a problem.
Thanks, Sarah. Olivier has his hand up.
Yeah, I have to say, I was hired because of my, my specialization, my field of study, so I would say in a museum setting, if it's a museum that its main goal is to study Canadian history. I mean, I would say, quite frankly, it's not it could be considered as an handicap, okay? Even in parts Canada, it is also, I would say, in some ways, if they have to consider two job applicants, they need to choose between one that is as a Canadianist and the non-Canadianist, they will consider the first one. But I would say if you're considering, let's say, working outside of your field of study and using your historian tools, or I mean, I don't think it's an handicap, really. It's an asset. It's just a question of finding the jobs that you're more likely to get. And I don't want to say that to discourage anyone, but sometimes it's just a question of what's the job description, right? So if it's to be a specialist in Canadian history, more than likely they will consider a Canadianist before a non-Canadianist. But if the idea is to provide advice about different topics that are outside of Canadian history, or I would say you could work for the have a federal government job or anything else.
Yeah, and I would just say if it's a research job, I don't know. A while ago it was land claims research, and you know how to use primary documents, and you can wade your way through early 19th century or 18th century documents. That could be for you. But Sharon's got her hand up.
I really love that question because I think it might almost be an advantage not being a Canadianist, going into the field of, perhaps changing the way Canadian histories have been taught. And so this is what has happened to me. Like, I was thrown in teaching sessional courses on pre and post Confed history, never having done this before, survey course thrown in. I had to do a lot of research and read the John Belshaw, open access book that's available online. But it allowed me to insert all the erasures that I've seen when we do Canadian history, right? Erasures from a BC context, at least in terms of South Asian histories, especially, or, Chinese, Japanese, like Asian Canadian histories as well. So, and also being a part of a Knowledge Network series looking at BC's untold history, which I was honored to be a part of. And through the relationships that I've built, accessing archives and materials that not everybody gets access to in public, easily accessible resources. So it's actually opened up the creativity for me to challenge a lot of the students who are coming in, who go in with perceptions about how Canadian history can be taught. So for me, it's exciting. It's exciting to see where I can intersperse different resources and perhaps change the way we perceive how Canadian histories can be taught. All my classes also go to the Sikh Heritage Museum for a tour. I always manage to make it squeeze into some sort of category, whether it's a history of emotions or history of race and anti-racism. I always make it some sort of relatedness to that site. And that's also the imagination aspect of how we teach Canadian histories.
Thanks, Sharon. Karen.
I really agree. I think non-Canadianists have a lot to bring to the table. And And I think for a lot of government jobs, it wouldn't matter at all. But I will say for my particular job, when I applied, you had to have an MA in Canadian history. That was non-negotiable. I don't know what the most recent posting said. I can't remember. But my PhD is actually in American history, and I feel like that has helped me a lot because of being aware of a lot of American literature and bringing that to bear on the projects I do now. So.
There is a really powerful question in here from Jessica, who said, thank you to the speakers, talks about creativity and about the experience of being disciplined, right, as we do with history. And Olivier, this was, again, something Stephen High pulled out in the chat as well, about how you resisted through the interdisciplinarity and the creativity of the work you were doing and how you were doing it. But there's this wonderful question from Jessica. Says, could you speak a little bit about how you preserved your sense of creativity while still in grad school, or how you revived it while being on the job market?
The thing is that what's great about being a PhD student, you know, is the freedom. Really, it's the fact that you can study anything you want and put it into perspective. And as I said, it's in some ways you do, if you do get a job, a more like a fixed hour job or things like that, you lose a little bit of that freedom, of that creativity. But you gain something else, I would say, in terms of, you know, tackling new topics and also being in touch with colleagues and being able to talk about, you know, different projects and stuff like that. So I would say, you know, you lose some freedom, but you do gain, you're able to get, you know, a lot of fulfilling task and so there's a way. And I would say that what's great about my job is like I'm able to also to do some research. You know, I'm not stuck into a 9-to-5 job where I just need to comply with what is required of me. I'm able also to have some free time to do some research project, to conduct research projects. So I would say I'm able to keep some of that freedom, but so I'm getting more experiences, but I lose somehow a part of that freedom.
I can speak to this one as well a little bit. In grad school, and then my decade of precarious teaching, and then since then now, I have been affectionately teased by everyone I've worked with or studied with for being sort of the queen of hobbies and extracurriculars. And, you know, there was never time for it, but I just did it because I would go insane if I didn't. So I took violin lessons when I was at York, and I learned to oil paint at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and once rode all the way back on the subway with a big streak of blue paint on my cheek that nobody told me about, and, you know, all these sorts of things, and joined a couple of choirs in different cities that I lived in. And you know, as I was moving around and being precarious, a lot of those things, sort of like Sharanjit was mentioning, like those community connections, those non-academic connections, were really sustaining for me on a sort of a soul level, and reminding myself that I was so much more than my academic work or how my job search was going, or whether I did or didn't have work for the next, you know, 4-month period, or, you know, and in a lot of really important ways, all of those non-history things, non-academic things, creative things, fed my work and made me, you know, a better writer. I wrote a whole novel during my PhD, just, you know, for an hour before I went to bed. I didn't feel like reading anymore at the end of the day, so I wrote a novel. And it was terrible, but it was so good for me, you know, as a writer, and just having something that was totally different. And, you know, I have gone on, when I was teaching on contract at UPEI, I took a creative writing class and have now written a better novel, you know, coming out of that is related to my history work, you know, and just all of these things that sort of, maybe they'll never go anywhere, but they're for me. And they help me to remember that, like, I have all these creative juices, and that sometimes things that I'm reading, or people I'm talking to, or songs that we're singing will just spark an idea, you know, like, oh wow, that would be a really interesting metaphor to talk about, you know, Red Cross health services in interwar Canada, or, you know, whatever. And I think it's so important to do things that are not the thing you're supposed to be doing if you want to feed that creativity and feed that sort of intellectual fire in you. You know, other people I know maybe don't do all of those things, but they read widely. Like they just read absolutely everything that's not the thing that they study, and that's kind of how they fuel that in themselves. So I would say, you know, definitely an important question to ask, and encourage everyone you know, and I actually did inspire a friend to learn the cello during our PhD years, and somebody else joined a theater group. And so I was kind of a little bit contagious, I think, in this way. And actually I'm very proud of that role that I played in my PhD cohort.
Cassandra.
Great question. I felt this profoundly in grad school, and I would get sort of just kind of anxious and stressed from only writing the dissertation or doing the things that we were supposed to be doing. And so for a while I struggled with this, and then I sort of got to a point where I realized that the anxiety of completely separating things that I was interested in doing with my work, like that anxiety would be too much to fully walk away. So I tried to figure out a way to bring in the creative things I wanted to do into things that would still be benefiting me, and still be helping me sort of along in sort of achieving the goals that I wanted to achieve. So I just, in doing some archival research, I found just this set of documents on 1920s radical theater, which has nothing to do with my dissertation, but I got to read these plays put on by Ukrainian communists in the 1920s, and they were just, I had the best time reading these plays that I got lost in it. And then I thought, wait a second, I can turn this into an article. There's something here. And so it was this side project that was really fun. And I had a blast doing, but it was still, again, checking boxes, right? And I hate to sort of be uncouth like that, but there is like a strategy to that. And then also a few years later, I wrote a graphic history. And so that was another way where I was doing it because I wanted to tell this story. I found this never before seen memoir of an internee from the First World War, and we didn't have any firsthand accounts like this. And so at first I was thinking I was going to put it in just an academic article that I was writing, and then I thought, wait a second, no, I think this is actually something that I want to reach a broader audience. And the way to do that, I felt, was through a graphic history, which were sort of all the rage in that moment. But it was also this way to get my hands on something a little bit more creative that was still me doing history, but that, yeah, allowed me to have that outlet. So I think there are so many ways to do it, whether you're doing it to completely disconnect or whether you're doing it to just give yourself an outlet while you're building towards your goals, whatever it is. I think there's so many ways to approach that problem and sort of get some things out.
Sharon, and then I know we're running out of time, and we haven't gotten all the questions, but Sharon, and then we'll see where we're at.
Yeah, so I had to answer this question because I loved the question, Jessica, because when I was close to finishing my PhD, everybody kept asking me, okay, so what do you want to do? Do you want to go into academia and just teach, or do you want to be a museum practitioner? And it became this either or, which I really struggled with. And when I completed, I realized I want to do both, because the creativity comes from being able to do both. And so why I jumped at your question was, you can do both. You can be a museum research practitioner and still teach within the academy. And in fact, you can incorporate the methodologies and practices of curatorial work into teaching as well. We have to remember the students who come into our classrooms and future historians learn differently. They don't always learn by reading textbooks upon textbooks or reading, PDF articles that are hundreds of pages of long. They may react to a meme. They may react to a TikTok. They may that's the world we are living in. I always say social media is the new archive. And I think as historians, we have to become attuned to these different ways of creativity, creating knowledge production around history. So I love your question. I think there's possibilities around what Cassandra was saying, right? To merge the two as well and foster that energy in you that keeps going.
Tell you what, this is a question that's probably best for maybe Olivier and Sharon and Karen. It's from Mike Roberts, and Mike raises this really good question about having gotten training in museums and archaeology before doing the PhD, and is concerned that will it will that experience become stale on the CV? Like, will potential employers see it and value it if, especially with COVID, hasn't had a chance to do that kind of work?
Yes and no. I think that kind of experience will still be really valuable, but some government jobs do say you have to have recent experience, like within the last 5 years. So it will just depend on the job posting. But I wouldn't discount it at all. It's still really important, and it might help you get other contracts now too.
The question of stale. I think since June of 2020, like the calls to accountability with the anti-racist movement and the Black Lives Matter resurgence across Canada has really challenged the museum sector in good ways. Like, I think there's a lot of excitement and potential. So I don't see anybody's background, whether it be a BA or an MA or any sort of even just experience, lived experience of being in the museum field becoming stale. In fact, I'm seeing more of a push to hire people with that expertise and background because of the calls to accountability. So I see a great, exciting shift taking place in the museum world as well, just from being in that field and having a lot of connections with museums here in BC and across Canada. So I don't think so. I think there's a lot of potential opportunities for up and coming students for sure.
I think that's probably time, except to really thank Cassandra and Karen and Sharon and Sarah and Olivier and all of you for a terrific session. The questions were great, the presentations were great, but let me just say thanks again to everybody, participants and presenters. Okay, and with that, I will just say thank you and take care, everybody.